If somebody would have told me 34 years ago that I would become a forecaster, I would have told them they're crazy. Anyways, this is a little bit of a story about myself and how I came into this and understanding how the real economy works. Probably if you're here, you're following me on the economic long wave or the Kondratieff cycle. And it's an interesting story. I think you'll find it fascinating in that I go into detail about how I came to understand how things work. But let's help you understand a little bit of my background and we'll take it from here. Okay, my story really started in 1989. And the reason is that was an important year as I got engaged at the time. And I remember this to this day. It was February 14th on a Tuesday, 1989. And if some people don't know, probably aging myself, is that real estate was actually peaking. It was in a mania, house prices tripled. And that Sunday, we actually bought real estate, and unknowingly, we purchased it right at the peak, as you can see there. So it wasn't a great start. I'm kind of smiling now, but it wasn't a pleasant. And if people know the story, there was a extended bear market for almost 7 years. And really tough for 4 years where real estate unwinded. Now, what's also interesting is I started the investment business in the same year. And that was a challenge because we're having this real estate that's starting to unwind. And then starting the investment business. And it was a financial challenge because as real estate started to unwind, we couldn't declare bankruptcy because we bought a condo and it dropped 50%. So I think you're going to get a little bit of an insight how I've gotten to this point. And that is specifically is real estate. So the first 5 years, I just started at a small firm, right? And I was trying to understand how to manage private wealth. And, it's a large independent firm. I'm not going to mention names here, but it was a fascinating experience. But the challenge was, what do I recommend for clients? There were so many choices, and it was really up to us to design a model because we were working with them individually. Now, lucky for me is that I'm curious, and two, it was wise enough with my massive ignorance to find the best at the time. So I scoured basically the investment world, and people know Warren Buffett, of course, but at the time, the man to be was John Templeton, and he was still managing the funds at the time. And what was interesting is that he was a very gracious man. And what I mean is gracious is that when I was searching and looking for guidance, he was my first mentor. And I went to go see him at a conference when he was here in Toronto. It was a fascinating story, but I was asking a lot of questions, and he asked me to come by after the show or the presentation, and we can talk further. And I was asking him a lot of questions. I told him my story. He explained his background, his story, which was fascinating, and growing up during the Great Depression and managing money in World War II. Actually starting the first mutual fund here in Canada, I think in 58, 59, I could be incorrect, and told me the progression and his philosophy about buying value. This resonated with me simply because value investing was looking at bargains. I just came off of a horrible experience purchasing an asset at the peak, and definitely I didn't want to make that mistake, let alone I wanted to, or my clients, to incur substantial losses. So I lapped up everything about what he did, his philosophy. And I got to be pretty good because I was selling off hot markets and looking at cheap markets, which was out of favor. That got me in a little bit of trouble because I was accused of market timing, but bottom line was the clients were happy making money and they weren't losing money. Capital preservation, you learn very quickly, is key. Now, I can't get into much detail, but most important thing is if you really want to learn how to invest in a basic way, I highly recommend John Templeton's book, his philosophy. It's really simple. It's just buying things at 50 cents to a dollar. He was a very spiritual man, and his philosophy was to sell the price at the asset at a fair value. So after a downturn, the earnings would recover, valuations would normalize, and he would sell at a fair value, and then he'd look for something else. Pretty simple. The other person I met, if you don't know, this is Peter Cundall, well-known Canadian, very successful mutual fund. These are the last of the gracious gentlemen of our era. I was lucky to be influenced by these individuals, and what I mean by that is that they were humble. They were very articulate, intelligent, inquisitive, and they never apologized for their mistakes, unlike so many professionals today. I remember, I think he was that picture in 99, and he was presenting, and 98 wasn't a good year for him. And of course, a lot of people were chastising him, right, for the performance. And what did he say? Well, my head was handed on a silver platter. So he was humble, never made any excuses for his performance. But long term, he did extremely well. So you can see. Now, I'll tell you one thing that's very important about these. When I started the investment business, not only were they bargain hunters, but normally they would hold 30 to 50% cash in their portfolios. That's unheard of today. I don't even think hedge funds do that. It's just fascinating how the investment world has changed. But if you think about it, this is a great philosophy to protecting your assets. I mean, that's what we were supposed to do, right? And today people are chasing performance. But what I loved about that style, and I still love it for clients' sake, is you can sleep at night, your clients can sleep at night. Sometimes the performance lags, but in the long haul, you're going to do very well. Now, after this time frame, about 1994, it was interesting. The industry was going through a great change because the real estate collapse, and that was happening around the world. And at the time, Japan was the so-called at the time the land of the rising sun, but as we know, they've been in we're in a very, very long real estate bear market, and we've come to understand it's because of demographics. But this was the time I was exposed to the long wave, and I've read his book in it. And again, I'll tell you, my strength is I'm just inquisitive. I'm curious how things work. And of course, when you've had losses, that's a very painful lesson. So if I'm going to be allocating capital for clients, losses were always at the forefront. But in the future, we were looking at this great boom, and Harry Dent's book was very popular, and he became very popular, and he picked the end for Japan, or let's say the long bull market where the world was thinking they were going to take over the world. But what's fascinating, it was the first time I was introduced to the idea of the long wave, or the Kondratieff cycle. And that was fascinating, how technology changes things. And that was really the start. And so I started looking, of course, for more information. This is a picture of Nikolai Kondratieff. So a quick story about him and why he's an influence, and sometimes you'll see him in my profile, or I allude to him quite a bit. And the reason is this. He was a Russian Marxist economist, and he wrote the theory, first started writing the theories and noticing these cycles in the capitalist system, of course, that first started at the advent of the steam engine. Why it's fascinating is that he made this, or he articulated to Stalin, that the capitalist system were going to collapse and go into a Great Depression, which he was correct. But that's not his famous call. Or let's say it's the first part of his famous call. The second one is that it would collapse, but it would come back even stronger. Now, that's very important because for that, he was chastised and Stalin didn't like it, and they've used other reasons, and he was sent to Siberia, and he was jailed in a prison, and later he was shot. Simply for articulating his discovery of this evolutionary aspect of the economic long wave, or capitalism, right? Capitalism is not a linear, there's a lot of other theories of economics, but the key difference of cyclical analysis or the long wave is that we understand there are phases of the long wave, and economic winters, depressions, are part of it. This is the only theory that includes recessions, real estate cycles, business cycles, and the long wave, hard landings. And this is just a period of rejuvenation for the next wave to go even higher. That was the appeal. So, of course, I had to download his book and purchase his book. And it was hard to understand because my background is not economics, right? I mean, it was actually studying to be a pilot, but economics was this boring field. But this field was fascinating because it explained things. And, you just think of history as this random things that happen, or let's say random points in history. But when I've read the long wave, said, oh, this is fascinating. And later, by the way, you come to realize it's a social cycle. It's reflective of all of us, right? It reflects progress, innovation, technology, human progress, social aspects of each cycle. We've come to understand there are 4 seasons in the long wave. So it really was the foundation to understanding the long wave. Now, I've put out, this is just an update, but this is the long waves, right? You can see that there's been 3 already. The last one is in the 30s. We peaked. I should have put the date there. But the peak was actually in the 70s when we've been in a down wave. And this is, or should show in about the 2030s at the latest. It's simply because economic growth isn't there. As we've seen with a lot of things, economic growth is being slowed in every decade. And the amount of leverage in the system cannot support, or let's say the financialized economy cannot be supported by the real economy. Now, this is some people think it's an S curve, but it is actually the growth model for Canada's GDP. The U.S. and Europe is similar, but you can see there's a theory that as the alarm is that, we're going into a hard landing, and I'll talk about this quickly later, that 2024, we could be entering an economic winter. And this is the 4th season of the long wave. So this one began in 1946. It peaked during the 70s. We've had economic fall, or we call that the monetary wave, and that is the fall in price of credit, where the financial economy takes over. And then it's overburdened, or it overburdens the real economy, and then you go through economic winter where you deleverage and restructure the economy toward the real economy. Now, at that point, it was interesting, I was studying Kondratieff, and then, of course, it's in a weird progress, but this is my learning, so I just want to take you through how I've come to my conclusions. And then, of course, I was exposed to Schumpeter, and who really named or called these long waves. And it was dry to read, but it was fascinating. And it was fascinating because, again, this explains this, and this explains this. Now everything was making sense to me. And at the time, I was making pretty good forecast because I was combining things, but I was missing a component. I really didn't know how to forecast outside of valuations, right? I didn't, or some people know this is technical analysis. And I dislike the name. I think it's more of a supply, demand, energy, momentum cycles, business cycles, and measuring those. But that's later in the story. But this was really, it laid the foundation for understanding the long waves. And also at the time, as we all know, this was really the beginning of the internet. The start, this is the internet, by the way, is the underlying foundation for Kondratieff's fifth wave, which we're currently building and should turn up probably by 2040. And that is a decentralized revolution that will emerge in the future. But this was the foundation. And at the same time, there were forums, and I discovered a long waves forum, and I was on there, from 96 as a lurker, then participating after 2000 until 2012. And that was the same time I left the investment world. And I'll get into the reasons a little bit later why. Now, the theories are really simple in that the Kondratieff is one long cycle, and it's usually, it's average 55 years. It's been extended, and it's only been extended for a simple reason. Since 71, we've been living on a fiat monetary system. So capitalism morphed into a theory called creditism, and it's unsustainable. Obviously, we're realizing that they believed that they could thwart the long wave, and Keynesian economics or economists believe that, in theory, that, we could delay the downturn or the hard landing. But you come to understand it's a social cycle, and society decides the future. Now, at this point, I was exposed to technical analysis, and I'd learned about this theory that there was an individual that actually had a long wave model. And I said, this is amazing, because I can allocate, clients' portfolio according to where we are in the business cycle, maximize their returns, minimize their risk. And if you know Martin Pring, he has an investment firm and manages wealth. Well, what's amazing is that the performance is there and the drawdowns are great, and he's preserving capital. Well, that to me is the perfect thing, right? It takes work, but the client wins. You win. Everybody wins here, is that we're not being exposed by being a passive investor and letting the markets dictate, because most clients can't tolerate. Now, there's quite a number of books on the long wave. And that was my confusing period, is that I was exposed to the long waves forum and theories about the long wave. But what was frustrating is there were so many interpretations. And I realized that there were some people who were just market oriented, some on the technology, others on the social cycle. And I thought, why not build and use them and put them together? Kondratieff and Schumpeter laid the foundation. There's been so many books and articles and references that have added to it, and there is a lot. But why not combine them and empower clients, individuals, businesses, political leaders to where we're going? Because the long wave is a reflection of society. I thought it was a timing tool, but what I've realized, it's really a social cycle that just repeats, because human beings at the core are no different. The only thing is different, of course, the technology we have today. But the all-season investor helped me formulate and build one for Canada. It simply is that and it's really was designed for myself, to be honest, because for my family and myself, I didn't want to incur losses, but I just love this. Again, it's work, but this is challenging. And again, my experience because of losses were, okay, how can I not risk the portfolio or risk savings or client savings, but make fantastic returns for clients? That is that you participate with most of the bull market and you avoid most of the bear market. This is not a tool that you can get absolute bottom or top. I had a bad record of choosing at the top real estate, and that still drives my thinking today. Only thing I've ever bought at the bottom for clients was gold in '99, and that was simply a recommendation of some people know he is Richard Russell, who wrote the Dow Theory letters, and we're still in that bull market since that point. But I was coming to understand the fiat monetary system and gold, so I said, okay, why not? And clients have benefited, of course. Now, around this time also, I was learning technical analysis, and then between about 1998 and 2005, a lot of books were coming out on the changing aspect of the future, because we knew the Kondratieff fourth wave that really had its foundation in the 30s was the rise of governments, and they were a small aspect of the economy, and we built this welfare state. Well, we're unfortunately hitting limits to that, and obviously that the trend into the future is a decentralized economy. Mostly that all that means is that decisions will be made by more about the individuals and communities, and technology is going to empower them. So either we see a fragmentation of countries in the future, or central powers will be decentralizing their powers to the local states. Again, because the control it is coming to individuals, just as the internet has empowered you, just as the smartphones, right? And those are technologies that they're all growth industries. Now, here's what's fascinating. This book was written before the solar revolution, 3D printing, artificial intelligence revolution, robotics, genomics, stem cells. Think of all those technologies that are growth industries. Renewable energy, that's part of solar. And they're growth industries because their product or service, so to speak, is becoming cheaper, which increases adoption rate. Does that make sense? So if you look at the underlying technology is really what's driving the decentralized renaissance, but it's the top-down largeness of governments that is not sustainable. And you have those two driving forces. So you have economics, or let me backtrack. You have technology driving economics, which drives the social cycle, which would eventually drive the political cycle. Some people mix that up. So again, the technology cycle drives the economic cycle, or the long wave, which drives the social cycle, society, how they are acting in each part of the wave, which then drives the political cycle, right? Politics is always the last to change. And so that's why we're looking for changes that will come from the economy and not performing well. At the time, during the Long Waves Forum, there was a fantastic book written by Michael Alexander. Got to know Mike, and we traded and he exchanged. And this is a very, very technical, heavy book, right? So for the Kondratieff nerds, so to speak, this is your book. I've got a digital and a hard copy, and my hard copy is just in pieces. And I've referenced a lot because Michael, a PhD in another field, did some great work, and was always extremely analytical. So if you're interested in the Kondratieff cycle, I highly recommend this book. because it just goes into detail. And there's some forecasts that they weren't correct, but again, Michael provided a great evolution to the knowledge of the long wave, why forecasters in the past were wrong, why this is being elongated. So it's a great book. And a lot of people know about the fourth turning. And what's interesting in the fourth turning, it complements the long wave. Actually, Michael alludes to it in his book, The Kondratieff Cycle. And the fourth turning is a different cycle. It's called the Seculum cycle. If you actually read the book, he'll actually allude to the Kondratieff cycle, and understands that there is no linear progress, right? Everything moves in cycles. And it's a great book. Very dark, written around that time, but it's forecasting speaks for itself. Another fantastic book, part of the process, this is more of the technology. Carleto Perez, she has a website, fantastic. And again, it really helped me conceptualize a long wave in my mind, right? I was building the technical side because I was managing capital, but I was trying to understand how do you forecast the future. And this really helped me conceptualize that theory. Another great book around the same time, specifically on the technologies, right? So now we're going to get to the point. The long wave is driven by technologies. It ends with unsustainable, unproductive debt and deleveraging the economy. We call it economic winter. Some people call it a depression, which Japan has gone through, right? We have to delever all that debt in the system because it's, today too much of it's gone toward real estate. While it's an industry, it's really unproductive because it's not generating or driving economic growth. It's just building an asset bubble. And we know what happened in Japan with that. How do you recommend this book for people who really want to delve into the A Long Way in the Technological Aspect, written by Richard Freeman? Now, this is around a time about 2000, and this is fascinating because I was still at that point, wasn't sure because the mania at the time, if again, maybe there isn't that many people around, but at the time, the NASDAQ was in a mania. And I thought John Templeton, who retired, because, he was 88 at the time, I thought maybe he's wrong. Maybe it is different this time. And, he's a senior, past his prime. Well, that's what I thought. And in the end, he ended up shorting the tech stocks. Total gains weren't 88 million, but it was about over 125 million. You can Google this and to find out. And boy, it was a relief because I was heavily in cash at the time for clients. And I remember around that time, or recall getting a phone call from compliance. So this is a great story. I have to articulate it. Because I was moving a lot of clients out of the market, and I got to meet a friend of mine, who's a good friend now, a compliance officer, and he asked me to the office, and I thought I was going to be fired. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, the market's overvalued. I don't want the clients to lose capital." And he closed the door and he said, "Look, you're right, but you should get all these things authorized." And I said, "I've talked to people. Of course, I didn't just move all their assets." And he said, "Well, at the time you didn't need a signature, but he made me understand that it would be prudent if I got everything signed." And of course, after that, I did. And it's a fascinating story because I met him, we became good friends. And a client, I recall, and she never did, she complained her portfolio wasn't in tech stocks and she was going to write to compliance. And I wish she did, because I would have framed that I was underinvested in techs and had too much cash. And then we know the markets collapsed. And I remember at the time my business tripled. simply because I was looking out for clients at the time. So it's an interesting story in that how I met. And the other reason why it's interesting is he introduced me to Elliott Wave, or socioeconomics, or socioeconomics, however you want to pronounce it. And I understand a lot of people are going to say Bob Proctor has been wrong for a long time. I think is that no model is perfect, but I loved his research and the way it was thinking, because it included the human being. You know, too many people today in models are money printing, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. But it resonated with me, and I don't use Elliott Wave, but I love reading the philosophy. And sometimes when they got it right, they got it right. So it's a fascinating field to understand. Now, a lot of people are aware, I use this, I like this here, but the reason is that there's you can see there's 3 cycles. And at the time, I wasn't aware of it, but there were 3 important cycles. And that blue one is the long wave. The red one is the real estate cycle, or the Kondratieff cycle. That's a 18 to 25 year cycle. And that green one is the business cycle. You know, sometimes it averages 4.3 years, sometimes as long as 8 years. Now, I understood the cycles, but it wasn't until later, after I left the business. It was just 6 months after I left, when I was still studying the long wave, that I understood the concept of energy and how everything moves in a cycle. Everything. And it was that epiphany that all of a sudden the whole long wave made sense. Except there's no linear growth. I mean, think of what doesn't have a cycle. There's a life cycle. Sound has a cycle. When you see, there's a cycle. Energy has a cycle. The climate has a cycle. There's a cycle in everything. And the long wave, the Kondratieff or the real estate and the business cycle are just reflective of that. And if you understand where you are in those, then you can predict. And technology has a cycle also, right? So all these cycles, then it was, wow. I mean, okay, this is phenomenal. And I can really start forecasting, because once you understand that. So when I was learning technical analysis, I never understood and put together the energy, right? Now, you think of it. I mean, technical analysis just is measuring rate of change in simplicity. So, right, you have this pen, you throw it up in the air. There's maximum velocity when you release it. It slows down before it peaks at the top and then slowly starts to fall, right? The technical analysis just measures that velocity. And what great technical analysis do is use that, and then they look for the oscillator or rate of change to roll over and draw a trend line, and when it breaks, and then they sell. And the opposite of the bottoms, in simplicity. This was the quote. I'm backtracking here, but this was John Templeton talking about technology stocks, and he just took advantage of the temporary insanity. I mean, he's not known for shorting stocks, but a man at that age and how successful he is and was up to that point was still able to. And that's a great thing about this industry. Time works in your favor as long as your cognitive abilities are there. I'm laughing at myself. Because experience works in your favor, doesn't work against you. Okay, this is the one I showed you before, but I just wanted to show again that the long wave, the growth is where I believe we're headed within this cycle, right? Now, the internet, this was just recently updated. I'll tell you why this is important. The internet is laying the foundation for the information revolution. And this information revolution is part of the next upwave, the fifth wave. And as we know, Bitcoin is being built on top of this, but other things are. In that, and this I still find amazing. To this day, 1 million people still are joining this information revolution. We haven't seen this type of information revolution since the printing press. Just think of the ignorance of the public before the advent of the printing press. Most of the knowledge was held by the churches of the time or powerful elite. And then the printing press came along, and it just launched revolution after revolution, and it caused political revolutions because the average person was questioning or challenging those in power, and it did led to also the Renaissance, as we know, the combination of the Italian Renaissance and the printing press just really exploded and really laid the foundation for all of this progress humanity has made since about 1500. And it's also important because just think of with YouTube or any information is that any person in the world can become an expert in a particular field very quickly. I mean, most of my knowledge was acquired through the internet, and then of course reading books and references and research on that particular product to come to understand it. So, and a lot of people have discounted that and have forgot about this information revolution, right? And this smartphone, just how powerful it is, how we're able to communicate with anybody in the world, and again, I have access to information, communicate virtually free. I make a phone call and I talk to somebody visually in another part of the world, and I have internet access that's free. I recall my parents used to pay hundreds of dollars, and to phone Italy in the 70s, and it'd be echo, and then the phone bill was crazy. That part is actually fine, amazing. Now, after 2012, this is going to be very brief, but very quick. It's important because to understand a little bit of myself, I had to leave the business for personal reasons because of my father was diagnosed with dementia, but something happened to me I didn't realize. And I'm including this because I know I can help other people. In that, I didn't realize at the time that I suffered from traumatic brain injury. And I discovered only 5 years ago, and I suffered from 2012 to 2018. Wasn't working, dealing with depression. Most people didn't realize I was. Gained a lot of weight, and I didn't know what was wrong with me. And I was watching a Joe Rogan show, and there were people on there talking about traumatic brain injury, and I said, well, that sounds like me. And so I said, well, I went to all these doctors, and I went to doctors, endocrinologists, specialists, and it's frustrating because I did go to an endocrinologist, and she did diagnose me that I had high prolactin levels and low testosterone, and hence why I was depressed, but didn't treat me. So I have a distrust with the medical community for obvious reasons. I'm sure other people do too. But I found a doctor, and he did diagnose me with traumatic brain injury, and I had a couple falls, but I had viral meningitis when I was young. Just a virus went to the brain. I suffered from massive migraines, headaches for 6 months. I collapsed at my parents' place. I was in the hospital for 4 days. Luckily for me, there was no permanent memory erase, but it caught up with me in my 50s, and it affected my career, my personal life, everything. But I'm alive today, and I'm alive simply because a doctor did care. Now, mind you, took 6 months to get there. And again, this about me is simply is because there might be some men and women that have succumbed to this. And I want to tell you there is hope. And if you suffer from traumatic brain injury, you need to find a doctor, and a doctor that can help you. And in my case, it was Dr. Comer here in Toronto. And he wrote a book, New Hope, Concussions, Traumatic Brain Injury, and Post-Traumatic. That's really from dealing with trauma in terms of, let's say, injury in the brain. Usually it's a lot of firemen have this, police officers, people in the police forces. A lot of people have trauma or head falls. So I had a combination of both. And I mentioned him, and it's unfortunate. I show him this book, and I highly recommend this book. It took 2 years. It takes 2 years to see him now. I see another doctor, but it takes 2 years. Now, I'm going to show this very quickly. That left picture is me 5 years ago. You can see the look on my face, pretty depressed. 50 pounds overweight. That picture was last year, year and a half ago. 62 years young, best shape of my life. And that's simply as a result of finding what's wrong with me, changing my diet, proper medication, and of course, the most important thing is supplements to help with the inflammation I have. And gradually it's gotten better. So I put this up as part about me because that if you feel that you have this condition, reach out to me and I'll tell you more about my journey, and maybe I'll do a video specifically, but know that there's hope out there regarding this affliction, because it impacts more people than we realize. So now, which would leads to where we are today. And that is, finally I was able to heal and then just started to come back into the real world. Never thought that was going to happen years ago. And my friend said, Joseph, with all your knowledge, you need to bring this to the public. And I started slowly. And some people have been following me on Twitter, and I've had this account for about 2 years. So it's going to be 3 years soon. And slowly put out the information, what I built, and this forecasting model. Now, I want to make a point here. Is this forecasting model, or I've had 4 financial lessons in 34 years. The first one was, of course, in '89. You know about that story. I didn't have any other ones until 2007. There were 2 of them. And that was, one, I was trusting money managers at the time to protect my clients. And of course, I knew what was coming. So that was the second bubble, and I did extremely well. My business did well from 2007, 2008, 9, 10, simply because, just as with Ray Dalio, his name was known because he made an excellent return in 2008, 5 or 6. I actually know a hedge fund manager. We're good friends, and we met on the Long Ways Forum. 28%, if I recall, in 2008. Wow. Yeah, I think the returns were between -4 and 5% for my clients, but I should have done better. And I was upset because I allocated it to funds that should have been high in cash, and they weren't. There was a change, and I was furious. And I said, you know what, I've got to do this on my own. I've got to build things because, I'm trusting people. I make a great call, and then I had this happen. So you can understand where I'm going with this. Now, the other lesson that year is I had the model tell me to reduce the gold holdings. Well, I thought the model was wrong, and my ego was right. And of course, my ego was wrong. Well, that was a great lesson, because after that, not only did I build an asset allocation model, and I've been building one to present to the public, but never was not going to listen to the models. If they change, I change, because the market is right. If it's in a bull market, it's a bull market for whatever reason. A bear market, you develop models, you better pay attention to them. So, bad timing in 89, great timing 2000, fantastic timing 2007, learned some lessons there, but one area got wrong, and that was real estate. And real estate, I thought I understood, but I really had to look into it. And then it was reading and find out. And then during the 2000 teens, I developed my model and realized real estate is driven by a demographic cycle, simple supply and demand. But there's other factors, and that is income, real income, and two other things, of course, are mortgages and the price of credit. And realized that policies at the time were trying to keep the Kondratieff fourth cycle for obvious reasons, because of the commitments and promises by governments, that they were going to kick the can down the road. And that road was going to run out between 2022 and 2024. And this is where we are today. Hence, part of the reason why I'm launching now. And that in that, by that time, is the demographics won't be there to support real estate moving forward. Supply will be growing exponentially, and that is simply because of the front end of the baby boomers. This next 25 years, there'll be an enormous amount of supply, and that's why Japan had a prolonged bear market in real estate. So now, the question is, at this part of the cycle, here we are, it's a bull or a bear market. And this is really important because allocation in this part of the Kondratieff cycle, or the economic long wave, is there are very high odds for substantial losses. And you don't want to succumb to substantial losses in your portfolio greater than 50%. Because 50% or greater, you're going to need 100% to get back to zero. And so this is why I've launched this at a part of this cycle, because the implications are huge. Now, for example, here's the U.S. market, and we thought that that bubble was going to end, and it was over, after the peak in 2005, and they had a bear market for about 7 years. But like most of the world, the collapse in interest rates because of COVID, we had one final blow-off, the millennial blow-off. And this is not the Case-Shiller, but you can see now this is rolling over. And this is significant because the cycles, as Schumpeter realized at the point, it was the converging long wave, the Kuznets, and the business cycle turning down that caused the Great Depression. I remember it was bank failures from real estate that caused the severity of the downturn. It wasn't the stock market, even though it collapsed almost 90%. And the same was true of real estate. Now, these are references that are books that are fantastic. And if you're a historian or you manage capital and you care about the future and want to understand that what's happening today has happened before, there's nothing new, I highly recommend all of these books. The Economic Disaster gives you a formula of why the peak is in, probably now, definitive for Canada. A Brief History of Doom just talks about real estate stock cycles and all types of booms that happened in the past and the implication. And Richard Vague books are fantastic. The Big Debt Crisis by Ray Dalio, a phenomenal book, and what causes deleveraging in parts of the cycle. And I'm sure you've read, or people that follow or understand cycles. He's got another phenomenal book. Highly recommended. That book, it really gives you insights, and there's a lot of models and quite a number of models that you can implement if you're a money manager. Manias, Panics, and Crashes. I've got 3 versions and a digital version because they're always updating, and you just find out it's just the same thing over and over again. It's just a different story. Humans never change. We're hearing that about real estate today. It's different. It's not different. It's not different. And I feel bad for those people who incur losses and will lose everything. I've been there. I know exactly what you're going to go through. It's a memory I don't want to recall, but sometimes I am forced to, because now, for the first time, quite a number of Canadians will be going through this process. So I can relate from a person who experienced purchasing real estate and watching what they worked hard and saved for just gone. And then you were owing money. And I'm sure there's a lot of them are not only hurt, but they're angry. And how does this bubble get out of hand, right? It's a question we have to ask. Who is responsible for this bubble? Why didn't we stop it? There were a lot of bears, myself and others have warned, look, this is going to end badly. And looks like that process already started. My heart goes out to you because I can relate. I can relate. That last book, this time is different. Not only is it detailed about history, but sovereign debt crisis, and we're looking at 8 centuries worth of data. And it's the same thing. What are the models? What are the inputs to help a person forecast what's coming? So I recommend, if you're interested, to take a look at these books. Now, here's the problem with real estate. And this is the challenge Canada has, really quickly, is that our population pyramid is it's just aging. And if you see there, that age group 30 to 35, which is usually the latter parts of the real estate cycle, is now just peaking. And I understand I'm going to hear about immigration, but immigrants, for the most part, do not have the income or the savings. They might be renting, but the problem is after they've purchased their homes, and that's peaking over the next year or two into 2025, we'll go through a bear market as we did from 1990 to 2000 after the baby boomers stopped buying. The other challenge, as I said before, we have accelerating supply. So this is the challenge with the future. And most of us have seen this picture that home prices in Canada have just run away from real incomes. This is not nominal. We are adjusting for inflation. I'm going to say this slowly. You see the cyclicality within that. Those two lines in Canada will meet. And historically, they'll overshoot to the downside. Unfortunately, I hate to tell you, there has never been an exception in history. If you look at this chart, ratio of home prices to wages in Canada, you can see here we're just out of the historical norm since about 1920. And it won't end well, unfortunately. Why won't it end well? We've now surpassed the private debt levels that Japan experienced at its peak in 1990-91 and the US in 1929. Both were private debt bubbles that succumbed to real estate or the cousinate cycle and impaired the banking system, which caused the crisis. In the end, what that's going to lead is a deleveraging, as the Japanese did and North Americans did between 1929 and 1946. We had a high savings rate. Now, is that long-term peak now? There's no evidence of that, but I believe sometime post 2024, Canada will be deleveraging. Now, this book, I posted recently that this book alludes to, as Schumpeter said, that it was a coincident downturn of 3 cycles in construction cycle, but we call it real estate, accounted for the severity of the Great Depression. The same thing with Japan. And I asked the question, are we set to enter into economic winter? And it's a long way in the downtrend. Yes, it peaked in the 70s. The business cycle in a downtrend definitively is real estate in a downtrend. We have housing starts slowing. Still an extreme, but more than likely that's going to peak sometime between now and 2024. Okay, what about the good news? The upwave. This is just a somatic wave of the technologies that drove every long wave, right? And we can see the different waves, the textile, railway, auto, computer, distributed intelligence, what we have now, and the future is nanotech. I'll tell you why that one is important really quickly. And this is for you Malthusians out there. We're laying the foundation for a replicator, and that is nanotechnology, molecular manufacturing, and with artificial intelligence, computer speed, 3D printing, these merging technologies, probably by the end of the century, and this is not based on my opinion. I asked Ray Kurzweil 10 years ago when he came to Toronto, I said, well, how long do you think before we have the replicator? And he said, I thought 200 years from now, 300, 500. He said probably converging technologies by the end of the century, which I was shocked. And that technology wave provides the foundation. And the other thing is that it means the end of capitalism. You know, this regenerative nature, like, what does it look like? I'm theorizing, right? But basically that is the answer to unlimited materials. Malthusians are vastly underestimating the capacity for us to produce anything we need. Something to think about. So, in the end here, the key aspect of the business cycles and the long waves, and what I've come to understand, is really that if you take all of the theories and put them together, what I have created, and the website and books and looting and this forecasting model is a summation of giants that I stand on their shoulders. And I always allude to Kondratieff. Like most of us, we just give a tip of a hat, so to speak, because this man was imprisoned and then killed for discovering an evolutionary economic system that all of us should be grateful for. It is understanding how things work. It is understanding that no matter how much vested interest want the tree to fall this way, it is going this way. And I think a lot of people know what I'm alluding to. The decentralized renaissance is inevitable because it's society that is pushing in that direction, and that will accelerate over the next 17 years. I think you've seen this. There are some individuals, and I think Martin Armstrong posted this, and this is the challenge. When you've come to understand so much of history, you're really doomed to just watch everybody go through it. And you can't do anything about it. And this is why I seem kind of nonchalant about economic winter and so forth but what can I do? We can inform people, but I can't change the cycle. I can't prevent the cycle. I can maybe impact 5% of the population before it's going to occur, and then what to do after. Because I'm just giving people a heads up, right, of what's coming. And this knowledge that I have is to give entrepreneurs a competitive advantage so they can become the next big industry. But really the core of the long wave and understanding history is it's impossible to stop progress, impossible to go in a direction the public doesn't want, impossible to prevent it because we just ignore history, right? Because we're ignorant. But I'll tell you the real challenge, and I come to discover this later. We're hardwired to think linear. We don't see cycles. We don't see that the real estate cycle is ending, or a business cycle is ending, or economic winter is approaching, or these new technologies. So all we see, and I think this is an evolutionary trait as human beings, but we're hardwired to think linear. Debt by the government, which we're running into a problem, grows exponentially. Technological evolutions, as you saw in that other chart, this one here, grows logarithmically, right? As one technology peaks, another one's there to replace it. But the underlying aspect is that we have a business cycle, a real estate cycle or cousinate cycle, and a long wave cycle that will impede. It's impossible to stop these, by the way. Marx theorized that governments can do it, but you get no growth, right? If you don't get these cycles of boom and bust, there's no growth. And look at North Korea, look at Cuba, right? If you suppress humanity and try to stop innovation, there won't be booms and busts, and there will be no evolutionary. Evolution is not a straight line. That's the reality. Now, the key is to understand this is that way you can just accept what's coming and not take it personally, but is informed. Anyways, I hope this gives you some insight about myself, my background, what I've gone through, how I've come to understand this long wave, these models that you will be seeing, forecasting, and it's really simple. I've just taken the past from the best in the world, built them, and forecast, and one model on top of the other one, and watch it unfold. As a forecaster, one last thing is that we might sometimes seem to be indifferent because we have to face the reality. We have to look at how humanity is, right? Because the seculum cycle, socioeconomics, the Armstrong cycle, the seculum cycle, and the long wave, of course, they're all social cycles of reflection of humanity, and we just repeat them. And if you ignore them, it will be financial hardship for those that just don't think they exist, which is just fine, right? Nobody's here to force you to accept this theory. The results will speak for itself. So I hope this gives you some insight, and I promise to make a short version, a little bit about my background, who I am, why I'm launching this, and how we're going to also have, by the way, before I forget, because I'm just running with this, is help accelerate humanity through the upcoming decentralized renaissance. And I will say it emphatically. It's an inevitable, unstoppable force, because technology, economics, eventually the public, and then the political cycle will all shift in that direction, because that's where the growth is, that's where the wealth is, that's where the productivity is, and that's where humanity's next step is. I didn't allude to a couple technologies that are going to rock our world, but that's the other reason for launching this long wave is basically to help people accelerate, give businesses a competitive advantage, help people who want to use a model. I'm not an advisor anymore. I'm just constructing a model. You should work with somebody, but information, so your chances and odds of being success are much greater. Anyways, thanks for listening. I kept it to an hour. I think I kept it to an hour. And We will talk soon. Thanks.